In the name of Christ, who forgives us. Amen. Amen. Sometimes you work on a sermon, and other times a sermon works on you. Hopefully it's always a little bit of both. This time it was more the latter than the former. I kept trying to be done, and it just kept working on me. This is a tough day to preach, the 10th anniversary of such horrific events in our nation's history, and our Welcome Back Sunday. Hard to hold those two realities together, hard to know how to speak. And then it's complicated further by these shocking readings, which tell us today of all days to forgive from our hearts. Well, that seems like really stupid advice. How on earth do you forgive terrorists? And why? Why is even more important. Why would you do that? I feel like I am treading on holy ground. I am tempted to take off my shoes. I ask your patience with me and your honesty, because I cannot help but preach what I believe I must preach, knowing that I know very little. I'm thinking about how forgiveness is such a holy mystery. How difficult it is to understand how those who have been traumatized cruelly by others can find the inner resources to heal, forgive, and move on. I am in awe of such people. From my own experience, which is admittedly minor, when I have been hurt by others, I have experienced two impulses, and sometimes both at the same time. One is to internalize the harm, to believe the cruelty, or to collapse under its weight and say, oh, I must be a terrible person, or I feel so depleted by this act, and to internalize that pain and struggle with feelings of worthlessness and helplessness. Alternately, there is the impulse to lash out, the impulse to protect myself at all costs, a rage that says, never, never, never again. A desire to use all of that energy of pain and anger to protect myself, to protect those I love. And though I would not consciously say it's about revenge, sometimes it is for people. For me, it's much more kind of an obsession with security. Two impulses in response to harm: to internalize the pain, to project it outward in a desperate attempt to protect myself. Today we have the story of Joseph, which represents a third response. Joseph, if you don't know the story, I'll try to summarize. Joseph's been thrown down a desert well by his brothers. A certain death sentence. He lucked out. They were going to kill him outright. And then they decided, well, let's not go that far. Let's just let him die in this pit. And then we won't have his blood on our hands. And lucky for them, there were some Egyptian traders coming by, and they said, oh, sweet, we can get rid of him without him having to die. We'll just give him, we'll sell him to the traders, and we'll make a little profit, and all will be well. Pretty significant sibling abuse. Joseph gets snapped up by the traders, sold as a slave in a wealthy and powerful man's house. And if you know the story, he makes good. I mean, this guy is so resilient. Instead of, he doesn't go into despair and he doesn't go into rage. He just kind of, plows ahead, makes good, does well, and then he gets, his boss, his wife, attempts to seduce him. And then when that doesn't work, she accuses him, and he winds up in jail. Pulls himself up by his bootstraps and gets knocked back down, and jail is not a nice place to be. Long story short, he works his way out of that situation too, and he winds up a second-hand guy in the land of Egypt. And then there's this horrible famine. And his brothers need food. And ironically, they come to him, and at first, they don't recognize him, though of course he recognizes them, but they need his help. And in this amazing passage today, we have the final confrontation, when everybody is revealed to everybody else. And the brothers are saying, oh, please don't kill us. And Joseph's response is really interesting. He says, you meant it for harm, but God meant it for good, which sounds like one of those platitudes. But it isn't just something he said. It is how he chose to live. At every juncture when he could have given up and curled up in despair or lashed out in rage, he chose instead to invest his energy in seeking the larger purposes of God for his life, or seeing what good could be done, for what way could be moved forward. Instead of looking back, he moved forward. I wonder if this isn't some of what Jesus is getting at when he talks about forgiving from the heart. That determination not to be defined by the past, but to look to God's purposes in the present moment. Jesus says, forgive your brother and sister from the heart. I don't think he means by that we need to send chocolates and Valentines to terrorists. He's not talking about being sentimental. Americans, when we say from the heart, we often mean that. We often mean warm fuzzies and soft, glowy scenes. But I don't think Jesus meant that at all. My hunch, what Jesus is saying when he says from the heart, is he's talking about going to that really deep place within where we are rooted and grounded in the love of God. That central core place beyond fear and pain, where we can align ourselves again with God's love and God's purposes. So that forgiveness becomes both a choice and a gift. It is a choice to consciously say, I will not lash out. It is a choice to say, I'm going to try to learn how to rise above this. And it is a gift because God knows it doesn't come natural. And we have to practice it. 77 times, Jesus suggests in this passage, which means, effectively, forever. Don't stop. Not after 4 times, 5 times, 6, 7, 8, 9. Spend your life learning this practice. Spend your life learning to invest in God's purposes. What would it be like if we were to do that? What would it be like? As a nation, over the last 10 years, we have invested trillions, $4 trillion, I think, dollars in wars overseas. 6,000 American lives have been lost in those wars, which is twice the number who were lost on 9/11. And hundreds of thousands of Afghan and Iraqi lives. We worked really hard over the last 10 years to find that elusive sense of security. I wonder what it would be like if we spent the next 10 years investing ourselves and putting the same kind of energy and resources into peace, working for wholeness. Imagine spending $4 trillion, sorry, billions, trillions, I get them all confused. Imagine spending $4 trillion. Imagine investing the lives of our people in trying to accomplish the Millennium Development Goals. What could we not do with $4 trillion in 10 years? What kind of peace could we foster on the planet by feeding people and providing education and ending malaria and AIDS? What resentment and anger might be diffused, undone, and redirected? I'm guessing that this is what Jesus is aiming at when he's talking about forgiveness. That forgiveness is not being defined by our pain, but being defined by God's purpose. And the miracle by which that transpires within us and without is truly a mystery, but one that has to be fed by the imagination and by spiritual practice, daily, weekly, moment by moment. This week I watched that Frontline program about hope and, faith and hope and something like that. I can't remember the title. It was absolutely an amazing program, 3 hours of investigation and discussion about faith responses and lack of faith in response to the events of 9/11. And the final segment of it, we are listening to different people talk about what they saw as they watched people jumping out those windows. And some of the folks reflecting on it saw an image of despair, helplessness, and hopelessness before such massive violence and evil. But some talked about those 2 folks who went holding hands. We don't know who they were. They could have been lovers for life. They could have been people who had just met. But in their last moment, they chose to reach out to each other and make that leap together. It seems to me that as we think about what forgiveness means for us here and now, in this place, in this church, that gesture is the same gesture we use midway through the service at our holy halftime that we sometimes call the peace. that gesture, is more than just being friendly. It's more than making nice. It's a sacrament of the greatest thing a human being can do, which is to reach out to another human being in acceptance and to make common cause. That's the work of the church at the heart of it. Not to despair, but to connect. To be a place of community that is all about healing and reconciliation and aligning ourselves to God's purposes. And we can do it in concrete ways, in small ways and in big ways. We can do it by fostering a reasonable understanding of Islam instead of an anxious and paranoid understanding. We can do it by caring for our veterans, bringing pants, by binding the wounds of the mentally ill, by simply companioning one another and practicing that love and forgiveness in our own community. Forgiveness means we are not defined by the evils others do to us, but by the compassionate power of God at work in our lives. It's a goal. It ain't perfect. We don't get there in a day. But we are called to practice. Let us choose to not be distracted by a pointless and endless pursuit of personal security. The heroes of that day were not so concerned. The heroes of that day ran up the towers eagerly to do the work they were called to do. Instead, let us receive each day as a gift to be liberally invested in the work of love. I'd like to read this last paragraph from our presiding bishop's call on the back of your bulletin. She says, "This 10th anniversary is above all an opportunity for reflection. Have we become more effective reconcilers as a result? Are we more committed to peacemaking? The greatest memorial to those who died 10 years ago will be a world more inclined toward peace. What are you doing to build a living memorial like that?"